Hey there guys, welcome back to the channel. It's the Caribbean Bookworm, and today, finally, I'm going to be giving you guys another book review, and that is Steven Weinberg's autobiography. Let's get into it. Hello again guys, welcome. If you're new here, this is a science slash bookish channel, and if you're in the best of luck that you like both science and bookish content, then you're in the right place. So if you're like, you could say physics, just book contents and whatnot in general, then definitely feel free to stick around, hit the like button and hit the subscribe button, because there's definitely more where this is coming from. But without further ado, let's actually jump into the review. So Steven Weinberg, this is someone that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, and I have actually kind of made a video about him indirectly already, and that is because Steven Weinberg is a heck of an interesting person. He is, well, I should say, the late theoretical physicist that worked on the Standard Model, particularly on the electroweak unification, so the unification of the electromagnetic force and the weak nuclear force, right alongside people like Abdus-Salam, Sheldon Glashow, and others who had worked on the electroweak force. And Weinberg had made numerous contributions to theoretical physics. So I think as I go through my review of the book, you would slowly start untangling some of those pieces. But in general, this book is about his life, and it is about his life, especially when he was a young student. So he recounts things from his high school years, but not a lot, of course, because I think he wrote this book around maybe 2019, 2020. Like, it's bits of like a journal or something that he had that are like stitched together, and a lot of the writing has been done like in the late 2010s. So of course you can't expect him to remember everything about his childhood, but the book is in principle about his early years all the way through his undergraduate, and especially a lot of time is spent on his graduate school experience and beyond that. So in principle, that's going to kind of, I think, nicely segue into the pros which I have for this book, since I'm going to talk about the pros and a little bit later about some small cons that I have. So the major pro that I have with this book is that it is quite personal. So you can see that he's talking about these things as if he were to have a conversation with perhaps a colleague, like, and a very close friend at that of a colleague. So he really, you could say, talks about his experiences like someone would be able to relate with him, and these are plentiful, especially some of which I think are really nice to read as a younger, you could say, person aspiring to some extent to try academia. I think there are some really valuable things in this autobiography, but in principle, I think the fact that it is so personal in narrative is a pretty nice thing. It does mean that there is a lack of dramatization, which has its own little bit of a con. It's not really a con for me, but I know that it's something that can affect your reading experience. But in general, yeah, I think that's one of the great aspects of it. Second thing is that he uses a lot of clear communication throughout the book, especially when it comes to technical concepts. And this, I think, is pretty nice because it showcases some of the skills that he had already put to use in past books, like The First 3 Minutes and some other popular science book which he has written. And I think that's pretty nice because there are a lot, of course, if you were to talk about the stuff that he worked on, which is like quantum field theory, the standard model of particle physics, and these types of things, these are things that can get very abstract for, you could say, someone not in the field extremely quickly. So there are many times which he really tries to just break things down and explains basically a bit of an intuitive picture of what he was working on. And I think that is pretty great, especially just to give you a little bit of a feel of the things that he was working on, while not, you could say, stopping completely while having an explanation. Like, it feels like the explanation is just naturally part of the narrative that he wants to tell for a chapter, which I think is a pretty nice and strong bit of the book. Especially what I like about that aspect of this book goes into directly my third pro, is the historical context, actually. I found myself learning a heck of a ton about the Standard Model and its development throughout this book. And I myself am someone who's taken courses in quantum field theory and who has done courses in particle physics in the past, so I at least have a little bit of a picture of what's going on already. But usually in classes, especially, these things go by really quickly. So I don't really internalize everything. Whereas here, of course, because he lived these things and these developments, he's telling these things from a first person perspective, which I think is extremely nice, because even the tiniest of details, like how the personality of someone who developed a key idea is, or something like that, all these things and these little stories serve as a way for you to kind of like sit for a moment and think, oh wait, these are real people and not just names I see in my textbook. Like, for example, if you've maybe done quantum field theory, a person that you might have heard their name quite a bit is this person known as Fadeev. And Fadeev is known because of his work on the renormalizability of certain quantum field theories. And in this book, Weinberg talks a lot about how after he was in Copenhagen, which he went, you could say, in between his like graduate school experience with his wife, because he also was recently wed and he wanted to go for a honeymoon in Europe. He basically, after he finished his experience and came back to the US, he worked immediately with Fadeev and talked quite a bit about his experience working with Fadeev, which I thought was interesting. Again, because it's someone that I've heard or seen their name mainly in terms of textbooks. So I thought that it'd be quite nice. Now, aside from learning a lot of interesting things about the Standard Model, I also found his bits on cosmology to be very interesting, because you can see throughout the various chapters that he is teasing a little bit about cosmology, and eventually he just goes right into it when he reaches a point where he starts talking about his work on cosmology, which, again, if you've maybe known a thing or two about Weinberg, he has actually done a lot of interesting work in cosmology. For example, working on the cosmological constant problem. He was actually one of the first people that accurately predicted the value of dark energy's density content, just, you could say, before it was actually announced observationally that dark energy is an actual thing. Weinberg used some anthropic reasoning, which I made a full video on recently, where he did actually kind of make an estimate as to whether or not, if you were assumed that the universe was made in such a way that it can have people living on it, you could say exist, then if you assume this sort of anthropic reasoning, then you can get the value of the cosmological constant that actually quite nicely lies into, you could say, the margin of what we actually observe, which is quite freaky and interesting. He talks a little bit about that and how that is something that puzzled him and that still continued to puzzle him, I would guess, even till up to his death. So I found all those cosmology aspects interesting, especially when he said what motivated him to get curious about astronomy and cosmology wasn't actually like you'd hear with some people who are just generally curious about astrophysics. It wasn't from maybe an early exposure to going to an observatory or something. It was, I think, a story that I found quite nice, and that's why I want to take my time just briefly explaining it. And that is that, in principle, he was bedridden after having fallen, I think, when visiting a place. So he walked and he tripped and he fell and he wasn't feeling quite well. He had back pain. So he had to rest at home for a couple of days. And I think his wife brought him a book, which I actually have on my shelf right behind me. And that is the Stellar Structure book by Chandrasekhar. And she brought that to him because she remembered her experience with taking an astronomy course when she was an undergraduate and really liking that. So she got Weinberg this Chandrasekhar book. Weinberg read through it and really liked the fact that particle physics could be used to describe the interior of stars, a motivation which honestly I found very relatable. Like, to me, that's also one of the coolest things about astrophysics. And after that, you could say spark, he always kept thinking about astrophysics in the back of his mind. I think that is something that even caught up, I think, up till the most recent times, where I think it was in 2017 or 18, where he wrote this full-blown textbook about astrophysics, which I'm still quite curious to maybe borrow or get. So there are many personal stories like this throughout Weinberg's book, and I think that's one of the best bits about like his writing. And also, one other historical, you could say, bit that I really liked was when he talked about experiments that were looking for this model, his and Abdus-Salam's model for the electroweak theory, because the hints of these things are very subtle, and this is where things can get a little bit jargony. But for example, he was describing how there were, of course, the discovery at CERN of the neutral current, which is a specific type of decay channel which you can get for leptons that have some particular property about parity violation and whatnot. It's quite jargony. I would really suggest you maybe check out a good YouTube video about parity violation or just about the electroweak force. But anyways, if you go with me for just a few seconds, he also explained how this was done using clever tabletop experiment setups. And that I thought to be super cool and interesting when he talked about how using just a simple setup with a vapor gas of some heavy element, I think it was bismuth, by having this vapor of bismuth and shining light on it in this nice controlled experimental setup, by looking at the polarization of light, since light comes in with a circular polarization, but it could be affected depending on the molecules of that vapor gas, that polarization of light could, you could say, indicate implicitly the presence of some neutral current, which in this case is an indication of the Z boson. And when people found this, which was something that he definitely wasn't expecting, it gave more credence, slowly but surely, to the Weinberg-Salam model for electroweak interactions. And I thought that exposure, especially his detailed layout and understanding about the experiment itself, I thought that to be a very impressive thing. I think the last pro that I have with this book is that he talks a lot about the two-body problem, the academic two-body problem, which is when both, you could say, people in a relationship are trying to pursue an academic career and the struggles of finding a job at the same geographical location. This is a very real, you could say, thing that academics deal with. And I mean, if you're a student and you have a partner and you've even played around with the thought of maybe staying in academia, you definitely maybe thought about this at one point or another. And I like the fact that throughout the book, he addresses this, that even when, for example, he was a staff member, this was still something that he thought about. I think the fact that not even later in his career, but even beforehand, he talks about the two-body problem and a lot. That is something that I really liked. Even though I saw some reviews, I think on Amazon, of people saying, oh yeah, he mentions his wife too much, I thought, well, those people are actually missing the point. The point is that he really cares about this wife so much, and that's why he's trying to make both his physics work and his, like, you could say, personal life really try to be in a nice synergy with each other, which I think is really nice thing to see. Especially since, you know, there's oftentimes a lot of physicists that maybe only hone in on their work and whatnot, and like, I really like the fact that Weinberg was being transparent about just the fact that, yeah, his personal life really matters a lot to him too. But that's enough pros. So let's talk about some small cons which I have with the book. One is the fact that he is really personal, which was my first pro. That can also be a very dry thing at times. That basically, if you really talk with a friend of yours or anyone in your life, or even think about yourself, it is not always that your life is exciting, right? And I think that's something that might kind of shock some people, because perhaps they're going into reading this autobiography and expecting this larger than life story, but that's really not it. It's like just him just talking about his life and experiences with no dramatization whatsoever. So things can occasionally feel a little bit boring. Like maybe he talks about, oh, we took this airlines to go to like XYZ airport. And he justifies even why he mentions some tiny details. So I personally really don't think that's a problem, but I know that this is something that could affect the reading experience. So maybe that's something to keep in mind. Second is that even though he does a lot of nice balancing with explaining things clearly and using rigor and jargon when possible, when he uses jargon, it gets very jargony. Like when he talks about perhaps some quantum field theory stuff, you can very quickly get lost. Like at some point, for example, he talks that when developing his electroweak model, or also when working on, because he worked on famously this thing known as effective field theory. So he talks a little bit about this and uses the jargon, for example, when he describes things like the current algebras and their associated symmetries for objects, and many jargony things. But all of them, I think, is extremely fascinating in this case if you are a student in high energy physics. Maybe a late undergraduate or especially a graduate student, I think you would love the heck out of those tiny details when he's discussing them. But for anyone else, it might feel a little bit too much. And the last con that I have is just one that I had for myself, which, I mean, I don't know if other people would have this, and that is that I wanted to read a little bit more about his life post the year 2000, because the book basically goes from his experiences in, like, I think the 60s or early 70s all the way to the late 80s and late 90s, but it kind of stops around the late 90s and maybe just the year 2000. It doesn't go beyond that. And Weinberg did quite a lot, like in between the year 2000 and like up till his passing, even 2021. And I wanted to see some of that because he got more involved in cosmology, like during the 2000s. He wrote one of my favorite papers so far, and that is Quantum Corrections to Cosmological Correlators, which is a super interesting paper if you like inflationary cosmology. But he also did a lot of stuff with more stuff about effective field theories, some stuff about like extra dimension quantum field theories, and even wrote textbooks. Again, like he wrote a really good cosmology textbook, this astrophysics textbook, and he was engaged with many extra things. So I wanted to see a little bit of that, but alas, that wasn't here. But that still doesn't influence my rating. I gave this book on Goodreads a 5 out of 5 because I absolutely liked it, especially for its raw honesty and shared experiences. It felt like being at an office of like an academic and having a nice honest chat with them, unfiltered. That's what reading this felt like. So I absolutely like that, with everything that comes with it. So yeah, that is my review for Steven Weinberg's autobiography. I hope you liked it, and if you've read this book or read something similar, do let me know in the comments down below, because I really like talking and thinking about autobiographies, especially of scientists. So whatever suggestion you have, just let me know. I'd be curious to check them out. I hope to see you soon for other reviews that I have in mind, and stay tuned. Bye-bye.